Hey everybody, welcome back to week 9 of Speech 101. You should be just finishing up with midterm, and what I've seen so far, midterms are going great, so I'm excited about that. But yeah, I mean, we had that 2 weeks to finish up 7 and 8, kind of relax, get back on track, and now we are pushing forward. You will notice I've posted an updated schedule in Moodle, so check that out just to get a sense of what every week is going to be. And then, yeah, I mean, in general, everything was explained in that earlier email. So if you have any lingering questions, let me know, but it should be pretty self-explanatory. So today, we are going to talk about persuasion. I actually ended up cutting group communication out of this week, so just ignore that. We're going to do group comm next week because persuasion is a really, really big topic, and I want to give it a lot of focus this week. So we're just going to talk about persuasion today. We're going to go ahead and talk about persuasive goals, persuasive questions, persuasive appeals, and some persuasive theories. And then, as usual, we will review. So, to get started, the biggest and primary question, of course, is what is persuasion, right? We need a working definition of the term persuasion in order for us to effectively discuss it in depth. So, the definition that we are going to use in this class is the process of changing, shaping, or reinforcing attitudes, beliefs, values, or behaviors, right? So any combination of these words is a type of persuasion, right? So the process of changing behaviors is a kind of persuasion. The process of reinforcing beliefs is a kind of persuasion, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Any combination of these makes up some sort of persuasion. And the way you go about your persuasion and achieving your persuasive goal will change based on which combination of things you are going for with your audience. So there's a number of different persuasive goals that you can strive for, that you can be looking to achieve. The most common one that people are sort of familiar with and think of when they think persuasion is to motivate the audience, right? You're persuading someone to do something, whether that's something that they've never wanted to do before, or if it's something that they've always wanted to do but haven't done yet, right? Like telling someone they should work out more, trying to persuade them to be healthier. A lot of people want to do that but haven't, right? So you're motivating your audience to take action. So any motivational speaker is a persuasive speaker, and their persuasive goal is to motivate the audience to change their behaviors. So if you look back at that previous slide, right, the process of changing behaviors is a type of persuasion. Another common persuasive goal is creating in the audience one or more new beliefs or attitudes, right? So it's not always about behaviors. It's not always about getting the audience to do something. Sometimes it's about getting the audience to have a new belief or a new attitude about a certain situation. Now, those are the ones that people usually think of when they think persuasive goals, right? You think of getting your audience to take a new behavior, take on a new belief, to agree with you on something. But persuasion is also reinforcing existing beliefs and attitudes and behaviors, right? We tend to think of persuasion as only taking someone who is against you and bringing them to your side, but it is also a type of persuasion to convince someone who agrees with you to be more strong in their belief, to be more steadfast in their support. Getting somebody who already agrees with you to strengthen that agreement is a strong persuasive goal and a totally reasonable type of persuasive speech, type of persuasive objective. The big thing to remember here is that persuasive goals are on a continuum. If you think back to our audience analysis section, remember we talked about the audience continuum of the hostile audience to the friendly audience and neutral in the middle. Persuasive goals exist along that continuum, right? So if your audience is neutral, then you're going to have different persuasive goals than if your audience is friendly or if your audience is hostile to your message, right? So understanding where your audience is allows you to understand what persuasive goal you need to try to achieve. So whenever we go into a persuasive speech, right, we have our persuasive goal, we know our audience, we know what we're trying to do, but we have to ask ourselves, is this goal a question of fact, a question of value, or a question of policy? Now, persuasive questions are a weird thing because they're not actually questions. We call them a persuasive question, but they won't be stated as a question, right? So a persuasive question might be something like the United States government should ban the use of bread as a weapon, whatever. But like saying like the US government should do this, or this thing is morally correct, right? Persuasive questions are actually statements, but we call them persuasive questions because you are sort of begging a question of your audience through those persuasive statements. So we have questions of fact, value, and policy are the three types of persuasive question you're going to run into. A question of fact asserts that something does exist, did exist, or will exist, right? And you are trying to convince your audience that this thing is true, that it does exist, it is a fact, and you're going to provide evidence to show them that it is factual, to get them to agree with you that it's factual. A question of value is about the worth or the morality of something, right? Saying this thing is valuable, it's good, it is right, it is just to do it, right? So a question of value would be, a question of fact would be something like, the question of fact would be trying to persuade your audience that global warming exists at all, right? You were just saying, scientifically, this is a thing that exists, and I'm going to tell you that, right? I'm going to persuade you to believe in the existence of this fact. The question of value would be more, we have a moral obligation to work to change global climate change, right? So question of value would be more like there is a moral imperative to do this action. Whereas a question of policy in that same topic would be more like the government should do this, or we should do this, right? You're not asking if it's morally good or correct. You are saying we should make a policy for it, right? So the way I think of it is if your ultimate goal is to change policy, right? Like that's the ultimate persuasive goal. You have to get through the first two to get there, right? You have to convince someone the thing exists at all. Then you have to convince them that it is morally correct to be on your side of the argument. And then you can get into the nitty-gritty of what specific policies should we put in place to make that moral thing happen, right? So the three types of persuasive questions, again, fact, value, policy, and pretty much any persuasive speech, persuasive appeal is going to fall into one of those three categories. So, speaking of persuasive appeals, let's go way, way, way back to our boy Aristotle. Whenever you talk about persuasion, you have to talk about Plato and Aristotle. It's impossible not to talk about the Greeks when we talk persuasion, because I'll try not to geek out too much. That's why I didn't put much on the slide, because I didn't want to talk too much, because I don't want to bore people. But if you look back to Plato and Aristotle's time, rhetoric and persuasion was actually a very coveted tool and a very powerful tool. It was new in a lot of ways, and a lot of the sort of rhetorical tricks that we would recognize now may not have been recognized by the public at that time. So you have this group of people called the Sophists who basically believed that all persuasion should be manipulative, and the intent of persuasion is to manipulate people into agreeing with you. But then you have people like Plato and Aristotle who believe that persuasion and rhetoric are more noble ideals and more noble goals, and they came up with theories and ideas of how to be persuasive while still being moral. And one of Aristotle's big ideas, now that's an oversimplification, so if you're a big Greek history nerd, I recognize that's not 100% everything, but it's all you're going to need to know for this class. But Aristotle came up with this sort of triangle of the three types of persuasive appeal that we can use. And he argued that we should have a balanced triangle, right? You should have all three of these types of appeals working together to create a strong foundation on which you can persuade an audience. So the three classical persuasive appeals from Aristotle are ethos, pathos, and logos. And I'm sure you've heard the three of these quite a few times. You may have heard me mention pathos when we talked about language. I made that joke about the word pathetic, right? When we talked about connotative to denotative bypassing. So pathos, I'll start with because we're familiar with it, right? Ethos, pathos, logos is kind of the correct order that you'll find it in almost any textbook. But let's start pathos because I've said it before, so you might be familiar with it. Pathos is an appeal to emotions, right? So anytime you're trying to convince your audience to be on your side through some kind of emotional argument, you are appealing to pathos, right? So those like ASCAP commercials, right? Or whatever it is, like all the sad puppies and the Sarah McLachlan music playing. That is a very pathos-driven emotional appeal, right? Anytime you're telling your audience like you should feel a certain emotion about this, or you're trying to draw an emotion out of them, you're using pathos. Ethos is an appeal to credibility. So anything we do to improve our own credibility is an ethos appeal. So doing good research, citing sources correctly, right? Dressing well, standing well, speaking well, all of our delivery stuff helps with our credibility. Everything that you do to appeal to your audience's idea of your credibility is an ethos appeal. Finally, we have logos, or appeals to logic. Logos appeals are anytime you are being very logical with your audience, right? So rather than saying like, you should support this because it's sad, you're saying you should support this because you think this thing leads to this, and this thing leads to this thing, therefore you should like this thing, right? Those sort of what Plato would have called syllogisms, those are logical appeals. And anytime we make a really like, you need to agree with this because this, and this very specific, realistic, almost scientific kind of approach to persuasion is a logical appeal. And as I said, Aristotle argued that you should have all three of these, right? So we don't want to just have a persuasive speech where we pop off on logic for like 10 minutes and just get really nitty gritty about logic. But we also don't want to just be sad for 10 minutes because people will get really overwhelmed by the sadness, and there's not a lot of substance to that. So what we really need to do is be credible speakers who appeal strongly to logic and use strong research and use strong support to back our arguments. That gives us logical grounds and credibility in the eyes of the audience, and then sort of flavor that with emotional appeals, right? Get the audience more engaged emotionally to really round out that persuasion. So, armed with these persuasive appeals, our next question becomes, how do we break down each of these three a little farther, right? How do we more pragmatically use these appeals? So I want to talk about motivational appeals. It is a subset of pathos, and it is basically, there are two major types of emotional appeals or motivational appeals that we can utilize. There are positive and negative. So easy to remember, positive, negative, they're opposites. A positive motivational appeal argues there will be a benefit to your life if you do this thing, right? So if the person persuading you is trying to say you should adopt a new behavior, a positive motivational appeal would say, if you adopt this behavior, you will be happier, right? That is giving you a positive emotion to associate with the action. Alternatively, a negative motivational appeal tries to instill a fear of not responding in the audience, right? So telling the audience, if you don't take this action, some horrible, awful thing is going to happen to you, right? Whether it's death of a loved one or of yourself, or loss of your home or loss of your family, whatever it is, you're creating this negative emotional response saying, if you don't take the action we're saying to take, here's the awful things that are going to happen to you. Not as a threat, right? You're not persuading your audience by blackmailing them or threatening them. You're just suggesting that realistically that is how things will play out if they don't take that action. So to break down ethos a little bit, so pathos we can break into positive, negative motivational appeals, and then credibility or ethos I want to break down a little bit and talk about, because credibility, I know we've talked about it like 3 times, but it is so important to everything we do in here. So credibility is the image of a source held in the mind of each receiver, right? So speakers with high credibility are obviously more believable. An audience sees a speaker, believes they have a higher credibility, and is ready to believe what they say and to take in what they say and agree with them and, you know, be on board with what they're doing. So to break that down even more specifically, if the receiver perceives the source as knowledgeable, honest, and charismatic, there is a higher likelihood of persuasion, right? Easy. This has been proven across a number of studies. A lot of research has been done on this. When audiences say that they believe a speaker is credible and knowledgeable and honest and charismatic, which all makes up credibility, they are more likely to be persuaded by that message, right? They are more likely to take a message and agree with it or be willing to bend a little bit for that speaker. So your credibility, your appeals to ethos have been scientifically proven to persuade the audience better, right? So they're really strong appeals and definitely should be used. So we've broken down these classical persuasive appeals, looked a little bit at pathos and ethos, and now I want to talk about some more modern theories of persuasion, right? So those classical appeals are sort of the original theory of persuasion. It was the first time that someone really sat down and wrote out, here's steps we can take to persuasion and how to do it. But of course, since then, a lot of people have written other theories about persuasion. So the persuasive theories I want to look at are consistency, social judgment theory, cognitive dissonance, the theory of reasoned action, planned behavior, and the gradual change approach. So first, consistency is this idea that audience are more likely to be receptive to a message that lines up with their beliefs and unreceptive to something that challenges their beliefs, right? And this probably seems really obvious because it is really obvious, but it's a theory worth knowing, and we should know that it is a theory. Oh, my Hulu just started auto-playing. I've been marathoning Brooklyn Nine-Nine all weekend. Okay, sorry about that. So, right, it seems pretty obvious that an audience is going to be more receptive to something they agree with and less receptive to something they don't agree with. But the reason we talk about consistency as a theory is because it leads us to social judgment theory, right? So it's not just about like, okay, if we agree, then we like it. If we disagree, we don't like it. The reason we do that is because we are always comparing what we hear to our existing beliefs and values, right? So anytime we take in and process information, we compare it against our existing beliefs, attitudes, and values, right? The BAV we talked about in the past. We compare it to our existing beliefs, attitudes, and values, and then make a determination of whether we fall into one of these three latitudes, whether we accept the new information, reject the new information, or if we're non-committal, which might sound familiar. An audience can be accepting, rejecting, right? Friendly, hostile, neutral, right? It all comes together, y'all. So there's three latitudes of social judgment theory: acceptance, rejection, non-commitment. And we determine that by comparing our beliefs to what we hear. So the acceptance latitude is a lot less critical, and it's going to have its beliefs reinforced, right? So if you already agree with something and someone starts making a persuasive speech about that thing, you are less likely to be critical of their arguments, of their performance, of their ideas, because it agrees with you, right? So when you are in the latitude of acceptance, it's likely that you're going to be like, oh yeah, no, they were a great speaker, they were awesome, they were super on top of it, because you agree with what they're saying. Now to the opposite end, if you are in the latitude of rejection, you're going to be very discrepant about everything the audience does, right? Or that the speaker does, because you're going to try and find reasons not to change your existing beliefs, right? You're going to try and find reasons to say, oh, well, they were a bad speaker, or they said this thing wrong, or they messed up on this, so they must not know what they're talking about, so I'm not even going to deal with it, right? So both of these are very low potential for change, right? If you are speaking to an audience that agrees with you, you're not going to change their minds much. You're just going to reinforce it. And if you're speaking to an audience that thinks you're completely stupid, you're not going to get them to change completely over to agreeing with you, right? You might be able to get a little budge, but not significant. Where the most persuasive change occurs is in this non-commitment group, right? Anyone who sits in the latitude of non-commitment is a high yield persuasive audience, right? There is an opportunity to significantly change their views from the current view of neutrality over to accepting your belief, right? So this is why in political campaigns, you see a lot of appeal to the center, right? To moderate voters, to undecided voters. Because in a two-party system, the people who agree with you already agree with you. And the people who disagree with you, it's really unlikely you're going to pull them to your side. But those middle ground people, the independent voters and the moderate voters and the undecided voters, have the potential to move either direction. So you really need to appeal to them and persuade them that your side is the right side, right? So next up, we have cognitive dissonance. And this is another sort of part of what we've been talking about, where cognitive dissonance occurs when we do this social judgment comparison, right? We compare what we hear to our beliefs and values, and we find out that something doesn't quite line up in terms of our beliefs and our actions, right? So this would be like if a speaker tells you, you know, if you take this action, Did you know you're secretly killing millions of people? And you would be like, but I don't want to kill people. That's against my beliefs, right? But now you find out your actions don't line up with your beliefs, and you have this dissonance, right? This disagreement, cognitive dissonance, right? It's fancy. So cognitive dissonance is the work that you do in response to that, right? So this conflict comes up where someone tells you, hey, you believe this, but you're doing this, and those don't fit, right? You can't take this action and believe this thing because that action hurts that thing. And you're like, oh God, I didn't know that. What do I do now? Well, there's a couple options. Some people choose to attack the source of the new information, right? You can stick to your guns and someone says, you know, your actions don't line up with your beliefs. And you can be like, well, your face doesn't line up with your other face, so shut up, right? That is an option. It's not a great response or a mature response, but it is an option to attack the source. You can also choose selective listening and focus on only certain parts of the message, right? Some people will just focus on, well, they said in this sentence that I'm doing a great job and they agree with my moral code, so I'm doing great and I don't need to change anything. That is an option. Probably the best one you can do is seek new information, right? You're not committing to a change in your beliefs, but you are saying, okay, something has come up that makes me believe my values might not align with my actions, so maybe it's time for me to do some more research and make sure that I'm doing the right thing, right? It is also an option to just shut down completely and stop listening, right? Someone brings up a cognitive dissonance to you and you're like, nope, and then you just ignore it completely and don't think about it anymore. Again, not a great option, but totally an option. And finally, you may change your mind, right? If someone's really persuasive and really effective at persuasion, they can create cognitive dissonance as a way for you to change your mind, right? I know this might just be the way I think about it because I am a music person, but the word dissonance in music is like a harmony that feels like it has to resolve somewhere, right? So if we hear two notes being played that sound kind of crunchy and gross, we want that dissonance to resolve somewhere. Cognitive dissonance functions the same way, right? If we as speakers can create that tension in our audiences, that cognitive dissonance, that wants to resolve. They want to do something to feel normal and resolved again. And if we are effective persuasive speakers, we can create that controlled dissonance and then suggest over here is the place to resolve, telling our audience like, hey, come along with me to this place and this dissonance will go away, right? So those are the 5 ways that people might respond to cognitive dissonance. And your goal as a speaker is to create a controlled amount of dissonance that you can resolve in an effective way that will make your audience more likely to be persuaded. So next up, we're going to talk about the theory of reasoned action, and this one goes along with the next one. So those first 3 kind of went together in a way. They help each other, they function together. Now we're on to a totally new concept. So the theory of reasoned action is this sort of flowchart of how we choose behaviors, right? So reasoned action says we have our attitude toward the behavior and a subjective norm, right, like the social norm, and that creates the intention of a behavior, which eventually will become a behavior. So for example, the example I love to use for this is yoga pants being pants, because for some reason that's a huge argument for some people. But, right, some people believe yoga pants are pants, and some people think yoga pants are not pants and should not be worn on their own as pants. Great. Good for you. But what theory of reasoned action suggests is that if you live somewhere where the subjective cultural norm is that, yes, they are pants, and your attitude toward the behavior is, yes, they are pants, awesome. Your behavioral intention is clear, and you will probably wear yoga pants as pants. Great. The issue arises when your attitude, let's say your attitude is, yes, yoga pants are pants, and the subjective norm differ. So if the subjective norm in your culture, say in your high school, was yoga pants are not pants and you're not allowed to wear them, then your attitude, yes, differs from the norm, no, and then there's this conflict here before the behavioral intention, right? So that's when you have to make a decision, right? Are you more worried about your personal attitude or more worried about the subjective norm? Obviously, this is really oversimplified, and there's other things that come into that decision calculus, which is why we have the theory of planned behavior. So the theory of planned behavior makes this a little more complex. It gives us the attitude and the subjective norm, but then it implies this perceived behavioral control. So this works in two ways. First, in our previous example, if your attitude toward the behavior is, yes, I should wear yoga pants as pants, and the subjective norm at your school is, no, you should not, but you have this perception that you are still able to wear them, right? There's no rules against it. There's a good chance you will still intend to use them and use that object, right? You will still wear yoga pants. But if there is a school rule that you'll get detention if you wear yoga pants, now your perceived behavioral control has gone down, right? You don't have the perception that you can control that behavior. So you might not have the intention to do it, and you might not do it. So that's the first way that theory of planned behavior functions, right? If there's a difference between your attitude and the subjective norm, your actual behavior will be influenced by your perception of behavioral control. The other way that this functions that I think is really important for persuasion is an audience will not take action unless they have perceived behavioral control. So if I try to persuade you all to give me $100, the likelihood of that happening is incredibly low. Because even if I create a positive attitude in the audience and the subjective norm is that donating $100 to me would be great, you probably don't have $100 to donate. I don't have $100 to just throw at my teacher. So your perceived behavioral control is very low. So the likelihood of you doing that thing is very low. However, if I give you a realistic goal, right? If I say, hey, we're raising money for charity, 25 cents each could make a world of difference. The subjective norm is that it's good to donate to charity. Your attitude toward the behavior, because of the persuasion, is telling you, hey, this is a good thing. And you have perceived behavioral control because 25 cents is not that much money. So there's a good chance of the behavior actually happening. So as persuasive speakers, we need to constantly be aware of the solutions and the actions that we are trying to get our audience to do, and make sure that those actions fall into the audience's perception of their own power over the situation. Now, the final persuasive theory I want to look at is called the gradual change approach, and this one is another kind of obvious one. Audiences are more likely to be favorable to a small change, right? So let's say your curfew is 10 p.m., right? You're 16 or something, your curfew is 10 p.m., and one night you're working on something and you call your mom from your friend's house and you're like, hey, can I stay till 2 in the morning? It's not going to happen. Right? If you try to push your curfew back by 4 hours, your audience is not going to respond well. But if you call your mom and you're like, hey, I'm working on this project and we're being really productive, can I just stay till 10:30? There's a chance, right? There's a chance they might just push it till 10:30. And then all of a sudden your curfew is 10:30 because whatever, we've been doing this is how it is, this is how it's running. And then a little later, you're like, hey, maybe push it to 11. Maybe it'll work, right? But if you just try to go straight from 10 to 11, it's a little less likely. If you go straight from 10 to 2 a.m., it's a lot less likely, right? So understanding where your audience is at and trying to create a small change in the audience across that continuum we talked about is a lot more effective than trying to push an audience from one side to the other immediately. So that's pretty much everything I've got for y'all today. It's a lot of information, so I do recommend watching it twice. I tried to keep it short to justify asking you to watch it twice. So we're under 30 minutes, but it's a lot of information and it's a lot of really important information. So please take the time to rewatch it, or at least to go over the PowerPoint. Really make sure this all makes sense. It's going to be very important on your next speech. So today we talked about persuasion, looked at goals, questions, appeals, and theories. Now we're reviewing. Thank you all so much. I'm really excited to get started on the second half of the semester. And I do want to say, for those of you who have given semester evals on that form already, thank you so much for your input. The stuff that's positive feels really good to hear. You know, it's nice to know I'm doing some stuff right. And the constructive feedback and the things you're concerned about have been really helpful to me in terms of seeing where I need to improve and where I can be doing a better job. And I'm hoping that you'll see in the next few weeks an improvement in those areas for y'all to have a better experience. So thank you so much for your time, and I will see you all next Friday with another one of these videos.